This evening I just decided a few random thoughts and observations rather than a worldview or decline of the West sort of presentation. These really revolve around what I think of as the last frontier, which is, or the first frontier, where the individual consciousness and the individual ends and the rest of the world starts. And the things that I put down really revolve around what is essential and what is important, to my mind, in the way in which we relate, obviously broadly to our society, but particularly to the arts, whether in an institution or in the privacy of our own home, looking through books, reading fiction, listening to music and so on. So what I'm basically going to do is simply make a few brief and fragmented observations. Perhaps we can elaborate on some of those later on. Rapture. Is it becoming increasingly difficult for museums to give people the one thing they want more than anything else? The fashion industry and the car industry and, of course, the advertising industry understand this perfectly. I'll even go so far as to upset the modernists and postmodernists by suggesting the entertainment industry, of which the art museums should not necessarily be a part, understands it perfectly well as well. And there are a couple of observations about art and the way in which we, experience it, consume it these days, which need to be reflected upon as well. Did the arts, particularly the visual arts, not to some extent shoot themselves in the foot when they decided, in an effort to be taken more seriously, they should call themselves an industry? I've always wondered about this, because henceforth, of course, they find themselves increasingly assessed as an industry alongside other industries. The never-ending drive for numbers has begun. And how could this not lead to the problem of extremes of non-commercial, non-business and non-populist programs and projects being labelled perhaps indulgent or pretentious, out of touch with the real world? And, what about car ads, I think to myself. With increasing democratisation comes a tendency toward a danger for the tendency toward the lowest common denominator. How dare someone voice this opinion in public, you might think, but just witness the way, for example, in which the 24-hour news cycle increasingly sets policy for some of our elected representatives. Fortunately, of course, nature still throws up the odd exception. So with a few of those random observations in mind, what should museums do? In what way should they find a more direct line into each of our individual lives? And how should artists collaborate and work with museums? I think one of the problems is that it's increasingly difficult for an artist not to be reasonable, not to push the boundaries, the ghastly expression, and one well suited to any artist so corrupted that this has become their main objective, of course. No even vaguely interesting art practitioner has the objective of unsettling their audience as a central concern. Every work that I've ever seen where this appears to be the main objective falls over very quickly. At what point should the state intercede in the priority of individual experience? The burgeoning OH&S bureaucracy indicates that, as it is the primary nature of bureaucracy to maintain and expand itself, the point will inevitably draw closer to every and any waking thought and action that we might take as individuals. If this is the case, how do we identify acceptable levels of risk in the creation and experience of art? I would propose that the society in which we find ourselves today is perfectly comfortable with significant and ongoing risk in its consumption, for example, of sport, including underage soccer, football and other contact sports, but that its tolerance, let alone encouragement of risk-taking in the arts, has become greatly diminished. What has occurred to create this situation, and how might it affect the way in which artists work with art institutions? Quite simply, I think sport has been elevated to the status of an essential in the life of the public imagination, Whereas the arts, and more particularly the visual arts, those disciplines that require stillness and silence, contemplation, for any serious appreciation and personal benefit, have found themselves perhaps relegated a little more to the margins. This devaluing process naturally has led to a diminishing of the acceptance of the idea that the making and consuming of art is a profound and essential part of society. Why might this be? I think that up until the end of the Industrial Revolution, pretty much everyone that had lived on the planet had thought that things were much the same in the past as they were in their time. If you like, cultural production and technology was extra-generational. Things occurred many years apart. The Egyptians were riding horses, and we were up until the end of the 19th century. In fact, stasis was the norm and change the exception. Now, of course, we live in a world where change is the norm and stasis is the exception. Imagine how differently the world must seem to us and how differently it must have seemed to people in the past. The active and contemplative life, you might remember those two statues in Renaissance paintings, comes to mind. It could almost be said that because business and the global economy depends upon activity, constant change, going, coming, using, reusing, building, tearing down and so on, renewing, constant change, that this must in some strange way work against the contemplation necessary to really appreciate the visual arts. There's another thing that I think is at work today too, and it comes in very subtle forms, and that I'd like to refer to as a rise in fundamentalism. And of course I mean all kinds, country and Western. The rise of fundamentalism, or the compression industry, I think has another very important role to play in the way in which people privately negotiate the arts and the way in which institutions publicly negotiate the arts. I think that you could almost use technology, which of course is wedded to mass production's wedded to mainstream culture. They're both inextricably bound up as a sort of an example. LPs, vinyl going to CDs, going to MP4s, going to MP3s and so forth. And while it involves one thing above all else to my mind, apart from convenience, and that is compression. If you think about the visual arts and photography, the great problem with the digital imaging technology, which I now use certainly in the printing of work, presents is a matter of compression. The distance between pure black and pure white is reducing all the time because of the effect of popular culture, or the conversation of popular culture and mass production, mass technology. Where once you might have thought there were 1,000 steps between black and white, you now see 10 steps. Indeed, I think that sometimes there's only one step. We see a lot of it in the public debate from time to time. But these things contribute to this, what I call, rather melodramatically, a rise in fundamentalism, I think, because they eliminate the grey area which really should occupy most of life. Most of life is grey. Most things are ultimately ambiguous. And this is where art lives. Art lives in an area that ultimately is ambiguous, that can't be kind of quantified and measured exactly. And so, once again, this is another issue for both artists as individuals and institutions. How do you negotiate this constant move toward compression, this constant move toward a form of fundamentalism, good versus evil, with us or against us, correct or incorrect? In a funny kind of way, mentioning sport before made me think one of the other reasons that sport is so popular is, of course, not only is it an activity and a constant sort of business of movement and change, it also revolves around definite winners and definite losers. In art, of course, there is no definitive outcome. Really, the best art experience involves going away with more questions than you came. But I think these issues really play an important part in the way in which artists and museums work together. There's a point at which the occupational health and safety issues collide with the world of the interior, if you like, and depending upon the autonomy and the enthusiasm of different institutions, we end up with more or less interesting installations and results. The most obvious example that comes to mind is an artist who decides they want a pitch black space. Some years ago, some of you may have had the experience of walking through a Mike Parr labyrinth, or even stumbling around a fairly dimly lit Bill Henson installation. But you wonder how far these things can go these days. You wonder at what point bureaucracy or a sense of a litigious society that we seem to have inherited too starts to sort of impose limitations on what's considered an acceptable experience. I think these things are playing an increasingly important part in the way in which institutions and individuals have to negotiate the public sphere. If you think about the whole business of photography, it's really remarkable. The grand tradition of street photography, 19th and 20th century tradition of street photography, is pretty much dead. Very, very hard to take a camera out and do something in public without being set upon by people who are anxiously wondering, what are you doing and why are you doing it? And this is a very odd situation as well, because of course if you were taking those photographs in the Strand or somewhere in London, you'd have 20 CCTV cameras filming you as a member of the public, but as a member of the public you would not be able to take photographs on the Strand. We end up with these strange relationships that are being altered, and I think that museums and art galleries have a very important role to play in interpreting and negotiating these situations as they come up. I think also where photography in particular is concerned, we have an unusual situation as photographers because the evidential authority of the medium precedes any individual reading of the photograph, and so there's always this dumb literalness, but also this sense of a photograph being proof of something. This can often have some very strange developments, and one we've seen a bit of recently relates to what is essentially a photographic process and the internet, images on the internet. Not so long ago I had a lunch with an old friend of mine, a writer, and we were discussing this and the fact that there's a constant conversation about how the internet has changed everything. Oh, the internet has changed everything. He looked at me and he said, what are they talking about? How has the internet changed human nature? What's going on? I mean, it's an interesting idea, or it's an interesting thing to reflect upon, because it seems sometimes when you listen to the public debate about images on the internet that we've almost been hoodwinked and taken back to the dark ages, where the idea that, the nefarious use of your image can result in, your soul being stolen. It's a very odd idea that, someone looking at a picture with motives other than your own has somehow taken control of your soul or taken some kind of power over you. And I think this is one of the most interesting debates that's still unfolding with regard to images, both photographic and otherwise, but certainly how it impacts, or how it has an impact on the arts. I suppose a few other things I'd like to say about the way in which artists and museums work together revolves around how important it is for museums to be truly radical. But I think being radical can sometimes mean doing less than's expected. You've all heard that expression that the most radical thing you can do when everyone's running in circles is to stand still. I sometimes worry about this push toward entertainment that occurs as a result of that arts industry thing I mentioned before, and the idea that you have to kind of be constantly appealing in new and novel ways to attract the general public or to attract funding and so forth. I think particularly young people are so blitzed and so media savvy, so awash in images, so immersed in a sea of electronic stimulus and whatever else, that in a way institutions might have another role to play here in saying slow down, stop for a minute. That whole idea of contemplation. Objects play a very important part in this role, in this process, because objects do require stillness and silence. We need stillness and silence for contemplation. And just slowing people down is often a tremendous gift. Suddenly your own personal space opens up. Suddenly, you have a space in which to daydream. There's not this constant cacophony filling every small recess of your mind. And I would say, although it might not sound very groovy, that the stillness and the silence and the quiet spaces in museums and galleries such as the National Gallery were one of the greatest gifts I received as a kid. I can dimly remember walking up the steps of the National Gallery when it was in Swanston Street. I went to the library there. But most of my sort of, conscious memories from down here, of course, I remember looking down into the hole when the building was coming up out of the ground. But I must say, when you grow up with television and radio and the internet and everything else, walking into a place which is perhaps placing a little more emphasis on silence and stillness may well be the most radical thing that the institution can do, creating the space in which personal reflection is possible. Not doing what the entertainment industry does, which is replacing one image very, very rapidly with another one straight away. I look at the Pixar movies and a lot of the high-tech digital imaging that goes on blue screen, whatever else now, and I think to myself, it's changing so rapidly that there's virtually not a second in which you can stop and reflect upon what you've just seen or heard. And for me, the value of places like the NGV does come very much from something that is almost the opposite of that, the time and the stillness and the space. How does a museum or an institution do that without appearing to lose touch, without appearing to be, strangely, what's the word? Not combative, but contrary, perhaps, when everyone is now so, conditioned as a part of life to accept, to expect the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next version of the film, the next version of a book, the next bestseller, the next everything else. I have to say, I think that objects emit a certain force. And for example, for me, the ancient fragments of ancient Greek sculpture and the Roman copies always strike me as though they contain secrets. I don't think you have strange revelations like that as a kid, which is what they first struck me as, see these strange vessels that contain secrets, unless you slow down, unless you're given the space and the quietness at which to look at these things. So really, I don't think there needs to be too much of a failure of nerve at that sort of level where we must be doing the next thing and the groovy thing and replacing it. I think just providing that space is possibly in a modern world, a modern commercial, globalised economic world, one of the most radical things that can happen in a public space. As far as artists themselves go, as I sort of said to Gerard earlier, I've always thought that the National Gallery and other museums that I was fortunate enough to visit over the years were like a tremendous gift. I can remember coming out of a long time I spent in Eastern Europe making photographs back in the 70s and arriving in Vienna and walking into the Kunsthistorischen Museum and quietly walking along these creaking parquetry floorboards and finding Titian's Shepherd and Nymph, late Titian painting. I spent a week looking at it. I was able to sit on a couch for a week in front of this incredible picture at no expense. It cost me nothing. And to stare at the paint and to be absolutely flabbergasted that after a week I still couldn't actually describe the colour in the flesh. It was just light. To walk into the Accademia in Venice and stand in front of that insane deposition of Titian's with the Sibyls on each side of the painting, and to see the painting move and squirm in front of you, and to try and sort of come to terms with how an object like this feels as though it's just made it into the physical world. That trajectory from the world of the imagination into the physical world, and how so often great art feels like it's just made it into the physical world. And that's part of the electrification of the experience, and also part of the sense of incredulity or amazement in front of these things. It's like, how can this be possible? Strong experiences like that start when we're young, but they continue, if we're lucky and fortunate, throughout our lives. And of course, we all carry our childhoods around inside us for the rest of our lives. So creating spaces which are mindful of or sensitive to the way in which we respond to art with our whole bodies is critically important. When you think about it, a lot of this is common sense. You become more conscious of yourself, I think, in a quiet space. There's a great book on the nature of and the effect of being a part of a crowd by Elias Canetti, Crowds and Power, an analysis, a strange historical roller coaster ride of how when you become part of a crowd, a cacophony, a wave of people, you can sometimes gain an unreasonable sort of sense of greater power, but of course it's always borrowed. But in a space where you want contemplation, I think providing the space and the silence is far more useful. So, in a way, experiencing art with your whole body, having the influence of the acoustic, the humidity, the barometric pressure, the sense of gravity, all of these subtle things, all of this information which is going into our whole bodies the whole time, is there for a museum to use to sort of somehow beautifully subvert modern life at one level, I almost want to say. These things are essential, I think, when I think of the way in which young people learn, young human animals, the way they experience life and the way they take in information. We don't really change as we get older. We take it in through our whole bodies. Some of you may have been reading the recent research Susan Greenfield, a neuroscientist in England, has been bringing out about screen time and the development of the human brain. You'll find that, in a way, there's a compression, to go back to that occurs with information when it's experienced on a screen, of course. And the problem that she's starting to pick up after 20 years of research is that extended screen time for young, soft brains is producing smaller brains. It's producing stupidity. It's quite simple. The reason for this is obvious. It's because the amount of information that a young body or an old body takes in through the whole body, running down the hill, falling out of a tree, burning your finger with playing with matches, whatever it is vast. How do you transmit effectively information about gravity, velocity, humidity, and things like that on a computer screen? Well, we do paraphrase it, but it's extremely compressed. So, to come back to the way in which museums need to be mindful of this in an age of this burgeoning and rapidly changing technology, I think paying more and more attention to the simple business of breathing and standing in spaces and becoming more sensitive to the way in which our body negotiates objects in space is one of the most radical things that contemporary art exhibitions can bring with them. I think in my case I like to always play with the lighting. I find it very interesting. Some people look at the dimness in some of my exhibitions and wonder whether it's happy or sad or good or bad, but for me, of course, it's just really interesting. And of course, every time you turn the lights down in a room, people slow down. They walk more slowly, they speak more quietly, they in a way automatically open themselves up to a more sensitive response to the environment they're put in. That's just one obvious way in which museums can bring people out of this constant sort of rolling roller coaster ride of distraction. You know, I want to call it, I wrote something here before, it's like a kind of a fuzz of distraction, a muzak that goes on the whole time, and our need can become almost a habit for this as a kind of humdrum of the unexceptional in the background. I think it's quite radical to be able to sort of turn off the background music of culture and turn off the endless conversation and turn off the constantly being in touch on the mobile phone, all of these things. They're quite radical though, and I think that the museums have a very important, a central role to play in resetting our clocks, a bit like bulbs that need to be cold for 12 weeks before they can come back to life again. We need our clocks reset. And so I think museums have a great opportunity to realise some of these fundamental and healthy readjustments that we need from time to time. I don't think there's anything in particular I want to say about my own practice. I don't think that it's necessary tonight. But I think underlying all these comments, I hope you understand that what I'm really talking about is the priority of individual experience and the fact that institutions and individuals are not actually naturally opposites to each other, that in fact they work beautifully together when there's sensitivity and intelligence. and being mindful of the way in which most people live their lives, and most of us have to live our lives, the most radical thing to do sometimes can be just to sort of stop and think. So thank you very much.